It's working fine. That sounds harmless, but in business, that phrase can hide a lot. The server is working fine until the hard drive fails. The backup system is working fine until someone needs to restore from it. The old process is working fine until the one person who understands it leaves. So, if your business has technology, workflows, or systems that only get attention after something breaks, stick around because working fine does not always mean healthy. Sometimes it just means not broken yet. Let's start it up. Hello and welcome to Stack and Startup Al Fresco. Today, I want to talk to you about the most dangerous phrase in business. It's working fine. Now, to be fair, sometimes that is true. Not every business needs the newest system. Not every piece of technology needs to be replaced just because something newer exists. And not every process needs to be rebuilt from scratch. But there is a major difference between stable and fragile but still functioning. That difference matters because a lot of business problems do not show up as disasters at first. They show up as small annoyances, slow systems, manual workarounds, recurring errors, processes that only one person understands. At first, those things feel manageable. Eventually, they become normal. And once a business normalizes fragility, it becomes much harder to see the risk building underneath. Let's look at the normalization of problems. One of the most dangerous things a business can do is get used to problems. Not because the business is careless, not because the team is lazy, not because nobody cares. Usually it happens because people are trying to keep the business moving. Something is slow, so they work around it. Something is confusing, so they ask the same person every time. Something breaks, just often enough to be annoying, but not enough to force a decision. And eventually, the problem becomes part of the routine. That's when it's working fine starts to get dangerous. Because sometimes the system is not working fine. The people around the system have just gotten very good at compensating for it. A slow computer becomes normal. A messy shared folder becomes normal. A process that only one person understands becomes normal. And once those things feel normal, they stop looking like risks. They just become, that's how we do things around here. That is a dangerous sentence in business. Because how we do things around here can mean a lot of different things. Sometimes it means culture. Sometimes it means experience. And sometimes it means a process that was supposed to be temporary 3 years ago somehow became company policy. That is the trap. Businesses adapt, and that is a strength. People will find shortcuts. People will solve problems. People will keep customers happy even when the systems behind the scenes are not helping them. But adaptability can hide dysfunction. A group of employees can make a bad process look better than it is. A patient team can make bad technology look more reliable than it is. A few daily workarounds can make a fragile operation look stable from the outside. So when leadership hears, it's working fine, the real question should be, is it actually working fine? Or are people quietly rescuing it every day? Because those are very different things. A healthy system works because it is reliable. A fragile system works because people keep saving it. And if your business depends on the same people saving the same systems over and over again, that is not stability. That is hidden risk. You see this all the time. The backup system, it exists, but nobody has tested a restore. The network mostly works, but everyone knows not to trust it during busy hours. The customer process technically works, but only because one person knows all the little exceptions. From the outside, that business may look fine. After all, work is getting done, customers are being served, and money is moving. But underneath that, the business may be carrying a lot of invisible friction. And invisible friction has a cost. It costs time, it costs attention, and it costs trust. That's why small recurring problems matter. Not every annoyance is an emergency. Not every clunky process needs to be rebuilt tomorrow. Not every old system needs to be replaced just because it is old. But repeated friction is information. If people keep complaining about the same thing, if the same workaround keeps showing up, if the same person keeps getting pulled in to fix the same issue, that is not random noise. That is the business telling you where something is weak. And the question there is, are you brave enough to listen? And the longer that weakness gets ignored, the more expensive it usually becomes to fix. Because now you are not just changing a tool, you are changing habits. You are untangling workarounds. You are cleaning up years of, we will just deal with this later. That is the real problem with normalization. It makes risk feel ordinary. It makes friction feel acceptable. It makes not broken yet feel the same as healthy. So before a business says it's working fine, it should ask, is this actually healthy? Or have we just gotten used to the pain? Because those are not the same thing. The next place it's working fine gets dangerous is with temporary solutions. Every business has them. And temporary solutions are not automatically bad. Sometimes they are necessary. Something breaks, something changes, something needs to get done before the end of the day. So, somebody finds a fix. That is normal. That is business. The problem starts when the temporary fix stops being temporary. A spreadsheet gets created to track something quickly. A shared password gets passed along because everyone needs access today. A piece of customer grade equipment gets installed because the business needs to get back online right now. None of those decisions have to be disasters in the moment. The spreadsheet might be useful. The shared access might solve an urgent problem, but should never be done. That quick hardware replacement might get people working again. But then the business gets busy. The emergency passes. Nobody circles back. And then 6 months later, or a year later, or 3 years later, that temporary fix is still sitting there. Only now, people have built real work around it. That is when it becomes dangerous because the business is no longer looking at a temporary fix. It is looking at an unofficial system. And unofficial systems are where a lot of operational risk hides. The spreadsheet is not just a spreadsheet anymore. Now it's where critical information lives. The shared login is not just a shortcut anymore. Now it is part of how the team gets work done. The quick replacement device is not just a patch anymore. Now it is part of the business infrastructure. And because everything appears to be working, nobody feels urgency. That is the trap. The business tells itself, we will clean that up later. We will document that later. We will replace that later. Later is a dangerous word in business because later has no deadline. Later has no owner. Later has no budget. Later usually means we are not going to think about this again until it hurts. And that is how temporary solutions become permanent problems. Not because someone made one bad decision, but because nobody created the second step. The first step was get us through today. Then the second step should have been now let's make this safe, stable, and sustainable. But a lot of businesses never get to that second step. They stop at survival. And survival is not the same thing as stability. This is where it's working fine becomes very misleading. Because technically, yes, the workaround may still work. People may still be using it. Customers may still be getting served. Revenue may still be coming in. But the question is not just, does it work? The question is, can the business safely depend on it? That is a different standard. A workaround can work and still be fragile. A process can function and still be undocumented. A system can keep running and still be one failure away from creating a serious problem. That is the part businesses miss. They look at the absence of disaster and mistake it for success. But nothing bad has happened yet is not a strategy It is a countdown. So if your business is relying on a temporary solution, ask 3 questions. First, who owns this? Not to assign blame, but to increase accountability. Second, what happens if it fails? So you are not figuring it out during an emergency. Third, when are we replacing it with something better? So you can have a plan and you can budget for it. Those 3 questions will tell you a lot. Because if nobody owns it, if nobody knows what happens when it fails, and there is no plan to replace it, then it is not a temporary solution anymore. It is hidden risk with a longer expiration date. And the longer it sits there, the more the business starts to depend on it. People build habits around it. Processes form around it. Decisions get made assuming it will always be there. That's what makes cleanup so painful later. You're not just removing a workaround. You are pulling on a thread that may be connected to half of your business. That is why businesses need to be careful with the phrase, "We'll fix it later." Because sometimes later becomes normal. Normal becomes policy. And policy becomes the thing everyone is afraid to change. Temporary solutions can be useful. They can help a business survive messy moments. But they need an expiration date. They need an owner. They need a follow-up plan. Otherwise, the business is not solving a problem. It is just postponing the bill. And when the bill comes due, it usually costs more than it would have cost to fix the problem early. Now let's look at the cost of waiting too long. The next problem with "it's working fine" is that it encourages waiting. And waiting feels responsible. Waiting feels careful. Waiting feels like you are saving money. Because if the system works, why spend money now? If the process still functions, why disrupt the team? If the equipment still turns on, why replace it? That logic can make sense for a while. Businesses have budgets. Businesses have priorities. Businesses cannot fix everything all at once. But there is a difference between delaying something strategically and ignoring something until it becomes an emergency. That is where waiting gets expensive. Because when a business waits too long, it usually loses 3 things: time, options, and calm. First, it loses time. When a system fails unexpectedly, the business does not get to fix the problem on a clean schedule. It has to fix the problem now. During the workday, during customer service, during production. Whatever was supposed to happen that day now has competition because the problem that was ignored has become the priority. And that is one of the hidden costs of waiting. It doesn't just cost money, it steals attention from the work the business was actually supposed to do. Second, the business loses options. When you plan ahead, you can compare solutions. You can budget properly. You can choose the right time to make the change. But when something breaks, your choices get smaller very quickly. Now the question is not, what is the best long-term option? The question becomes, what can we get working by tomorrow? That is a very different decision, and it usually leads to more temporary fixes, more rush spending, more compromises that will have to be cleaned up later. Third, the business can lose calm, and that matters more than people think. Calm decisions are usually better decisions. Emergency decisions are usually more expensive decisions. When everyone is under pressure, people skip steps. They accept weaker options. They overpay for speed. And they make choices based on fear instead of strategy. That is how a small warning sign becomes a large business problem. Not all at once, but because the business kept saying, we will deal with it later. The old computer that was slow but usable, the backup system that existed but untested, the network issue was annoying but survivable. Until one day, usable becomes unusable. Untested becomes unavailable. And annoying becomes disruptive. And suddenly, the business is not making a technology decision anymore. It is making a business continuity decision. Can people work? Can customers be served? Can the business keep operating? That is a much more serious conversation, and it is usually happening at the worst possible time. This is why "it's working fine" can be such a costly phrase, because it focuses on the present moment. It asks, is this system working today? But business owners also need to ask, what happens if this stops working tomorrow? That question changes the conversation, because now you're not just thinking about whether something works, you're thinking about how much the business depends on it. And dependency is where risk lives. If one old device fails, does work stop? If one person is unavailable, does the process stop? If one system goes down, does the business lose visibility, access, or even revenue? Those are not scare questions. Those are planning questions. And planning questions are a lot easier to answer before something breaks. A business does not need to replace every old system immediately. It doesn't need to rebuild every process tomorrow. It does not need to spend money just because something could go wrong. But it does need visibility. It needs to know what is aging. It needs to know what is fragile. And it needs to know what would hurt if it failed. That's the difference between being cautious and being surprised. Because sometimes the expensive part is not the repair. Sometimes the expensive part is the downtime. Sometimes it is the lost productivity. Sometimes it is the rushed decision made because nobody planned ahead. That is why waiting too long rarely save as much money as people think. It may delay the expense, but it can also increase the cost. Because when the business finally has to deal with the problem, it is not just paying for the fix, it is paying for the urgency, it is paying for the disruption, it is paying for all the time it spent pretending the warning signs did not matter. And that is the real cost of it's working fine. It can make a business feel like it's being careful when it is really just running out the clock. So the question is not, can we get a little more life out of this? Sometimes you can. Sometimes that is the right call. But the better question is, if this fails before we are ready, what does this cost us? That is the question that tells you whether waiting is a strategy or just another risk the business has gotten used to. At the center of all of this is visibility. Because a business cannot manage a risk it does not see. And one of the hardest things about it's working fine is that it can make risk invisible. If the system still turns on, if the process still produces a result, if the team has learned how to work around the problem, then from the outside, everything looks fine. But fine is not always the same as visible. A business can see the work getting done. It can see the invoice going out. It can see the customer being served. But it may not see what it took to make that happen. That is where operational risk hides. It hides in the extra steps. It hides in the undocumented knowledge. It hides in the things people do every day just to keep the business moving. And because those things are familiar, they stop getting attention. Nobody notices the extra click. Nobody notices the manual correction. Nobody notices the person who fixes the same problem every week. But those details matter because visibility is not about knowing whether something works. Visibility is knowing how something works, who it depends on, and what happens if it stops working. That is the difference between a business that is guessing and a business that understands its own operation. A lot of companies think they understand their systems until something changes. An employee leaves, a vendor changes pricing, a piece of equipment fails. And suddenly, the business discovers the process was not as clear as everyone thought. The documentation was not as complete as everyone assumed. The backup plan was not as real as everyone had hoped. That is a brutal moment because the business is not just dealing with the original problem anymore. Now, it is also dealing with everything it did not know. That is why visibility matters. Not because businesses need to obsess over every tiny detail. Not because every risk deserves immediate action. Not because the goal is perfection. The goal is awareness. The goal is knowing where the weak points are. The goal is making decisions on purpose instead of finding out the hard way. There's a big difference between saying, we know this system is old and we have a replacement plan, and saying, we did not realize this system was holding half the business together. There's a big difference between saying, we know only one person understands this workflow and we are documenting it, and saying, we cannot finish this project because that person is unavailable. And there's a big difference between saying, we know the backup needs testing and it is scheduled, and saying, we thought the backup was fine until we needed it. That is risk visibility. It doesn't mean every problem gets fixed immediately. It means the business knows what it is choosing. Because sometimes a business may choose to wait. Sometimes the budget is not there yet. And sometimes there are bigger priorities that the timing is not right. And that is reality. But choosing to wait is different from accidentally ignoring the problem. One is a decision. The other is a blind spot. And blind spots are dangerous because they do not feel like decisions. But once the business has visibility, that phrase changes. It's working fine. It's no longer the end of a conversation. It becomes the start of better questions. Like, how reliable is it? Who owns it? What happens if it fails? Those questions do not need to create panic. They create clarity. And clarity is what lets businesses make better decisions. Because without visibility, a business is depending on assumptions. Assumptions about systems. Assumptions about people. Assumptions about risk. And assumptions that sometimes comfortable right up until they are wrong. That is why outside perspective can be useful. Sometimes the business is too close to its own friction. The team has adapted. The habits are established. The workaround feels normal. So when someone comes in from the outside and asks, why are you doing it that way? That question can feel annoying, but it can also be valuable. Because sometimes the thing everyone stopped questioning is exactly the thing that needs attention. Again, this is not about chasing perfect systems. Perfect systems do not exist. Every business has trade offs, every business has constraints. Every business has something it would fix tomorrow if it had time and money were unlimited. But mature businesses do not need perfection. They need visibility. They need to know what is fragile. They need to know what is undocumented. They need to know what is being held together by habit instead of design. Because once risk is visible, the business can decide what to do: fix it now, plan for it later, or accept it intentionally. Those are all valid business decisions. But they are only decisions if the business actually understands the risk. That is the real issue with "it's working fine." It can shut down curiosity. It can stop the business from asking the next question. It can make people mistake activity for health. So, when something in the business is working fine, don't stop there. Ask what is underneath it. Ask who is supporting it. Ask what would happen if it failed. Because the goal is not to be scared of every weakness. The goal is to stop being surprised by the weakness you could have seen coming. So, what should a business actually do with this? Because the answer is not replace everything. That is not realistic. It's also not responsible. And frankly, it's not that good of business advice. The point is not to panic every time something gets old. The point is not to rebuild every process because it has a little friction. The point is not to spend money just because someone said the word risk. The point is to stop using "it's working fine" as the only test. Because working fine is a very low bar. A chair with one loose leg might still be working fine. A car with a weird noise might still be working fine. A business system held together by memory, luck, and one very patient employee might still be working fine. But that does not mean it is healthy. So instead of asking, "does it still work?" ask 3 better questions. First, is it reliable? Second, is it maintainable? Third, is it safe to depend on? Those 3 questions will tell you a lot. Because reliability tells you whether the system performs consistently. Maintainability tells you whether the business can support it over time. And dependency tells you how much pain you are in if it fails. That is a much better conversation than, "well, it worked yesterday." Start with reliability. If something works, but only most of the time, that matters. The network drops during busy hours. That matters. If the software slowdowns every time the team needs it most, that matters. If people have to restart equipment every morning just to begin the day, that matters. Reliability is not about perfection. Nothing is perfect. But if a system keeps creating the same problem, the business should stop treating that as a surprise. At some point, the pattern is the message. The second question is maintainability. Can the business actually support the thing it depends on? That means, can people understand it? Can people update it? Can people fix it without turning the whole company upside down? This is where old systems get tricky. Sometimes old technology is fine. Sometimes an old process is fine. Sometimes a simple setup is exactly what the business needs. But if only one person understands it, if nobody knows where the documentation is, if replacing it would be a nightmare because nobody knows how it was built, then the problem is not age. The problem is maintainability. A system can be old and stable. A system can be simple and effective. A system can be boring and completely acceptable. Boring is not the enemy. Fragile is the enemy. The third question is dependency. How much does this business depend on this? Because not every broken thing creates the same level of pain. If a rarely used printer fails, that is annoying. If the main billing system fails, that is difficult. If one employee's laptop fails, that is inconvenient. If the only copy of a critical file lives on that laptop, now you have a real problem. The more the business depends on something, the less comfortable it should be with uncertainty. That does not mean every important system needs to be expensive. It doesn't mean that every process needs enterprise software. It means the business should understand what is critical, what is fragile, and what deserves attention before it becomes a crisis. So instead of looking at the whole business and saying, everything needs to be fixed, start smaller. Look for recurring problems. Look for the undocumented processes. Look for the systems everyone quietly depends on. That is the practical starting point, not the biggest project, not the most expensive system, not the flashiest upgrade. Start with the places where known friction keeps repeating. Because repeated friction is usually trying to tell you something. If people keep asking the same question, something is unclear. If people keep creating the same workaround, something is broken. If people keep depending on the same person to rescue the process, something is too fragile. That does not mean the answer is always technology. Sometimes the answer is documentation. Sometimes the answer is training. Sometimes the answer is assigning ownership. That is why businesses should be careful about jumping straight into tools. A new tool can help, but a new tool will not automatically fix a confused process. A new system will not automatically fix unclear ownership. A new dashboard will not automatically fix the fact that nobody knows what decision it is supposed to support. Tools are useful, but clarity comes first. So if a business wants to get serious about this, do a simple review. Pick one system. Pick one workflow. Pick one recurring problem. Then ask, who owns this? How does it work? What happens if it fails? That does not require a committee. It does not require a 6-month transformation project. It does not require turning the business upside down. It just requires paying attention to the parts of the business that have been allowed to run on autopilot. And once you find the weak point, you do not need to fix everything immediately. You can decide, fix it now or plan for it later, accepting the risk intentionally. But make it a real decision, not a shrug, not an assumption, not another version of, we will deal with it later. That is the shift. Operational maturity is not about having perfect systems. It is about knowing the difference between stable and fragile, but familiar. It is about knowing when something is actually healthy and when everyone has just gotten used to the pain. And it is about asking better questions before the business is forced to answer them under pressure. So the next time someone says, it's working fine, do not treat that as the end of the conversation. Treat it as the beginning of one. Ask if it is reliable. Ask if it is maintainable. Ask if the business can safely depend on it. Because once you know the answer to those questions, you are no longer guessing. You are managing the business on purpose. I was nearly fired due to a temporary process that was designed to get product out and never addressed the actual concerns. Where I worked, we repaired and tested equipment. In that process, we noticed a lot of modules failed at a very strict, but not very demanding test. This was just enough for us to hunt for the right module that would get us to pass that test. So, a workaround was developed. It was developed by someone who would later retire and put a sequence in motion that would have caused half the team to get fired if they had started with me. This included, but not limited to, some management as well. We ended up about losing 2 weeks of production with the investigations and going back and forth with the engineering team to either change the testing method or change the acceptance levels. Personally, I would have changed the testing method to what we were doing as to isolate some variables. But either way, the process was fixed. That tribal knowledge of someone who was long since retired was tossed, and I got to live to fight another day. The most dangerous operational problems usually do not announce themselves. They don't always show up as dramatic failures. They don't always come with a flashing warning light. They don't always stop business in its tracks. And a lot of the time, they show up quietly. A system gets slower, a process gets messier, a workaround gets older. And because the business keeps moving, everyone assumes the business is fine. Work is still getting done, customers are still being served, money is still moving. But motion is not the same thing as health. A business can be moving and still be carrying risk. A system can be functioning and still be fragile. A process can be familiar and still be broken. That is why it's working fine deserves a second look. Not because everything needs to be replaced, not because every annoyance is a crisis, Not because business should spend money just to feel safer, but because working fine should not be the end of the conversation. It should be the start of better questions, such as, is this reliable? Is this maintainable? Is this safe to depend on? Those questions matter because the goal is not perfection. The goal is awareness. The goal is to know where your weak points are before they make the decision for you. So, the next time someone says, it's working fine, maybe the right response is, good. Now let's make sure it actually is. So to close this out, it's working fine. Sometimes that is true. And when it is true, great. Do not create problems where none exist. Do not replace stable systems just because something newer is available. Do not turn every small annoyance into a major project. But don't ignore the warning signs either. If the same issues keep coming back, if there's the same workaround keeps holding everything together, if the same person keeps rescuing the same process, then the business is probably trying to tell you something. The question is, are you willing to listen before it gets expensive? Thank you for tuning in to Stack and Startup Al Fresco. If you've enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe so you do not miss future conversations around business, technology, and growth. You can find us anywhere you get your podcasts. And if you want to directly support the show, you can become a patron at patreon.com/stackandstartup. Until next time, keep thinking outside the box.